This is Food for Thought with Deborah Walker. Today on Food for Thought, I have the lovely Max Tuck, aka the Raw Food Scientist, back on with me. She's talking about her latest book, which is coming out soon on bone health. How are you today, Max?
Good as ever, thanks very much. Yes, full of action, ready to go as normal.
I love the way you say full of action. And you're training at the moment for a marathon, aren't you?
I am. I'm going to be in the Brighton Marathon on the 12th of April, and I'm going to be fundraising for a charity that's quite close to my heart, actually. It's a local charity called Big World Impact. So if any of your listeners want to jump onto Big World Impact and make a donation on my behalf for my 26 miles, I'd be really grateful.
Wow. And how have you managed to fit that in on top of writing a book and doing all your workshops and everything else you do?
I am not absolutely sure, to be honest. I worked out on Sunday after I'd done yet another 20-mile run. I worked out that since I started my mileage training for the marathon, which was around about September of 2014, I've run over 1,000 miles. So it's actually been quite hard to fit in, but I'll say two things to that. Number one, I don't watch TV, and number two, I don't need much sleep, which is just as well with my schedule.
Anyway, I'm completely in awe, but that is a raw food diet, and that is a completely clean diet that's actually fueling you, isn't it?
Totally. I don't know if there's any way I could do this if I didn't eat and live the way that I do, because some of your listeners may know that I already am on a 100% raw food diet. They also might not know that I don't drink alcohol and I don't drink tea and coffee and the sort of stimulant substances, if you like, that can give you that sort of temporary high but then give you a crash. So I don't participate in kind of, I suppose, normal activities for a lot of people, because I just wouldn't function if I did that.
And, in the words of Adamant, don't drink, don't smoke. What do you do?
What do I do? I run and I work and I write books and I talk on radio stations.
You just have masses of energy to do all the things you love instead.
Yeah, well, exactly. I don't see why I need to, sort of poison myself to fit in with what's considered normal. I'd rather be abnormal.
Yeah, I find that's a fascinating response that you've just given me. You don't poison yourself, because actually, in many respects, many people wouldn't think of alcohol and the sugar and all the stimulants that they're actually taking. They wouldn't think that they are poisoning themselves, but, in many respects they are, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I firmly believe that. And having been somebody that in the past did drink alcohol and did have a fairly high sugar diet, I think as students we all do that, don't we? If I did that now, I know what would happen, because I have actually tried it in different ways, such as, for example, after having a long period of time on a low glycemic raw food diet, I went out for a meal and had a raw dessert, which was fantastic, and it was sugar, and it was, raw fruit, obviously high glycemic fruit, and nuts, and all those things that we might think are really healthy. But I actually crashed afterwards. I felt awful. So even within, sort of raw treat foods, if I have a large quantity of anything like that, which always sounds like a really good idea at the time, I will definitely suffer as a result. So it's only once you really start upgrading your lifestyle and upgrading everything that you do, including your diet, that you really notice the difference when you deviate from that. And so I'm not into the downgrades anymore. It might sound like it's a really hard thing doing what I do, but I'm so used to it. I've been doing it for such a long time that to me it's completely normal, and any deviation from that doesn't make me feel good. So why bother doing it?
Exactly. Now, just outline for me what a low glycemic raw food diet would be over the general raw food diets, because actually you've touched on something that I actually have a big passion for as well, about the glycemic side of things. So just outline that and why it's important.
I think it's really important from the point of view of blood sugar stabilization. So, for example, let's just go back to the glycemic thing. Glycemic load relates to how much sugar you're absorbing. And sugar is present in pretty much everything. You'll find sugar in a lot of anticipated places, but you'll also find it in a lot of non-anticipated places. And certain fruit, for example, is very high sugar, and the glycemic load relates not just to the sugar content, but how rapidly that sugar is absorbed into the body. So, for example, dried dates would be high glycemic, and I will confess that when I'm out on my 20 and 22 mile runs, I take 4 dates with me, and around about 15 miles I'll stuff 1 or 2 of them into me just to make sure that I've got enough to fuel me through the next few miles. Now, that's fine if you're doing 3-hour runs, but if you're not, if you're sitting in front of a computer or sitting in front of the TV, then that's going to have a different effect in your body because you're not using the sugar. It's fine to have a bit of a high sugar hit if you're utilizing it straight away. In other words, if you're in the middle of a distance endurance event, for example. So that's absolutely fine. But if you're not utilizing it, that's when it starts to be a problem. And you don't want to be bombarding your cells with high performance fuel when you're not performing at a high level. So that's a little bit about the glycemic load. But also just talking about the raw food diet and which diets that people follow. When we're talking about raw food, there's so many different ways of doing it. And one particular way is to eat a lot of fruit. Another particular way is to minimize your fruit intake and focus on the greens and the sprouted foods. And that's what I do. So even though I am a long distance runner, I focus on the lower glycemic foods because I'm not running 24 hours a day. And when I do my runs, I will have something to fuel me beforehand, and I'll have something to replenish the fuel afterwards. But it's not going to be high sugar. And the reason for that is because I don't want to spike my blood sugar levels and therefore spike my insulin response on a regular basis by shoveling in fuel that is too high in sugar, even for somebody that's as active as I am. So I focus on the greens because they have the most minerals. I focus on the sprouted foods because ultimately they give you the most energy. And I don't focus on things like I would certainly never juice fruit. All of my juices are green only, so that they don't spike my blood sugar. And they also contain proteins such as sunflower greens and pea shoots and various other things that balance out the blood sugar. So hopefully that's kind of given a bit of an overview about the glycemic load. And because I'm on a raw food diet, we can think of the glycemic load applying to every single type of food. So people on a more standard Western diet might think of bread, and white bread would be a high glycemic food. Pasta would be a high glycemic food, etc. So when you eliminate those, you still can think about what your glycemic load is going to be, depending on whether or not you put a lot of emphasis on fruit in your diet as somebody that's eating a more natural diet, or whether you go down the greens route. And I will say I've done both. When I first started on a high percentage raw diet, it was fruit all the way. Fruit for breakfast, fruit for lunch, fruit for dinner, and all the enamel fell off my teeth. So that was not a good thing to do, because in the UK we can't get ripe tropical fruit. Tropical fruit's a fantastic food. If you're living in the tropics and you're picking it straight off the tree, there's nothing better than that. But for those that are reliant on imported hybridized high sugar fruits, and you're eating them in this far north, then that's a bad idea in my opinion. And from personal experience, the high greens, high sprouted foods raw diet suits me far, far better than anything that's high fruit.
Now, many people would actually say at that point, how are you getting enough calories in?
I am getting enough calories in, and my weight hasn't really changed since September, since I started my high mileage road racing. Now, calories are not as relevant as everybody thinks. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns with calories is that we are thought to need, what is it for an adult woman, 2,000 calories a day?
Yeah, more or less.
That's, I think, been increased. In the States, you're allowed more. Even though they've got the biggest obesity crisis in the world, with the possible exception of Mexico. So I'm actually quite in awe of why they think a 2,000 calorie diet is appropriate for the standard average relatively sedentary person, because there are people in other parts of the world, some people would call very underdeveloped parts of the world, who eat 1,400 calories a day and are running up and down mountains all the time. So these people are lean, they're muscular, but they are not what I would describe as thin. So I stopped thinking about calories a long time ago. I eat to appetite because, fortunately, I'm one of these people who's been doing a healthy routine for so long that my appetite tells me when I need to eat more and it tells me when I need to eat less. So where do I get my calories from? My smoothies are quite big. Chia seeds, which I use following a long run, chia porridge, I'm a big fan of after my long runs, particularly when it's cold. I eat that. It's raw, but it still makes me feel like I've had a really substantial meal. And I think from the point of view of calories, they're not as important as everybody used to think. I think what's most important is the nutrient density of your diet, because yes, you need a certain amount of calories to fuel you to stop you losing weight. But ultimately, when you are doing, for example, endurance exercise like I am, what happens in the body is you get these changes and you become a more efficient machine, so to speak. So the more you train, the more efficient you become, and the more efficient the conversion of fuel to energy is. So I don't need to eat necessarily as much as everybody might think for the amount of exercise that I'm doing, because my diet is very, very high nutritional density. My digestion is good and I absorb everything I need from it. So you might find that some people of my age would have a less efficient digestion, so they wouldn't necessarily be absorbing everything they need. Whereas if you flip that on its head and you think of yourself as an endurance and absorption machine, then the caloric intake is not quite as relevant as you might think.
Lovely. Thank you very much for answering that. Okay, so the next question I know that is going to be on some people's minds is, and I'm going to link this in with the bone book now.
Yeah.
Where are you getting your calcium from?
Oh,
you can't possibly get enough calcium, can you, for your bones?
Can't get enough calcium for my bones. That's all covered in one of the chapters, which is called Calcium Less Important Than You Might Think. And in the book, what I actually do is I bring in a little section called Lessons from South Africa. Now, in South Africa, you have a very interesting population called the Bantu, native South Africans. And they have the world's lowest calcium intake, and they do not have osteoporosis. So we've kind of got things wrong somewhere along the line. And yes, calcium is important, and calcium is one of the components of bone. But there are other components of bone, and if we only focus on calcium, we really are missing a trick, because we've got to think about calcium in relation to everything else. And what does calcium do in bone? It gives it some of the structure that we see on x-rays. And yes, it's true, if you have really, 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 really low calcium in your diet, then your bones might possibly suffer. But it does depend on what other minerals you've got. So we mustn't overlook magnesium, for example. Magnesium's very important, and possibly more important from a structural perspective in the bone tissue than calcium is. And that's covered as well in the following the chapter that follows the calcium section. And I like to think of calcium as being important to a degree, but not to the exclusion of everything else, because the crystalline matrix, the hydroxyapatite crystalline structure that is our bone tissue fundamentally, contains all sorts of stuff. It's not just calcium.
And this is where you have to have a really wide-ranging diet.
You do, yeah. And the good point about the diet that I follow, the high green foods diet, in other words, lots of leafy vegetables and lots of sprouted food, is that it's very mineral dense. And it's not just calcium we're looking at. It's calcium, it's magnesium, it's boron, it's carbon, because that's important for other reasons. There's a little section at the front of the book which describes really some new information that's come through from some scientists in the States who've been studying the structure of materials. So things such such as bits of wood and applying that to what's the structure, what's the function, how resistant to breaking is it. And I had a really interesting Skype interview whilst I was researching for the book with with one of these scientists that's written a scientific paper that was published in Nature in 2005. And I was fortunate enough, by some quirk of fate, to be able to get on Skype with him and have a discussion for chapter 2 of the book, which was just all about really the structure and function of our bone tissue and how it really all works. And talking to him, it was just amazing, because going back to calcium, he said calcium's, kind of not particularly relevant. Well, it is relevant, but not as relevant as everybody thinks. And one thing I'd like to kind of throw in here, if we've got time, is there is a material in nature that's really interesting, and it is 97% hydroxyapatite. In other words, 97% of the composition of this stuff is exactly the same as our bones. And if you add in 3% organic material, which is a protein type structure, you increase the strength and the resistance to breakage of that material by 3,000 times, which practically had me falling over on my back thinking, oh my God, we're really missing something here, because everybody thinks about calcium as being what determines our bone strength. It's not. It really isn't the whole story. It's the other bits and pieces that are within our bones, such as the protein structure, that give the bones their resistance to fracture, because bone is a composite material. And the best way to test how strong it is to take it out of the body and hit it with a hammer. In other words, can you actually determine how strong a bone is and how resistant it is to being broken? And the best way to do that, says this scientist, is take it out of the body, hit it with a hammer, and see what happens. Now, obviously, we don't, fortunately, perform experiments like that in the civilized world. But it's very interesting, the fact that just by adding 3% organic material to a structure that's pretty much similar to our bones, we get that 3,000 times increase in its strength and its resistance to breakage. And that tissue is, in case anybody's interested, abalone shell. And the question is, does the stuff that's in the abalone shell, is it present in our bones as well? And the answer is yes, it has found to be the case. It is in our bones. And it's a protein structure that's involved in the overall makeup of our bone tissue. So not only do we have to think about the mineral content of the bones, we've got to think about this protein stuff that's also contributing a massive amount to the strength and fracture resistance of our bony tissue. And what are proteins made of? Proteins are made of carbon and hydrogen and phosphorus and oxygen and a few other things. And what allows our proteins to degenerate? Well, there's a lot of things that do, but vitamin C, for example, is important for integrity of our protein structure. We know that from the fact that to have good skin, we need decent vitamin C levels, because in the absence of good vitamin C levels, our collagen, one of the structural proteins in our skin, starts to degenerate. Now, we've got a little bit of collagen in our bones, but it's not the collagen that contributes to this tensile strength of the bone. It's a different type of protein. And that different type of protein is under the influence of everything we're doing with our nutrition. And one of the interesting things about sugar, which we were mentioning earlier, is it degrades our protein structure. And since we've now got this fascinating new protein that's only been recently discovered in bone tissue, we don't want to allow that to degrade. So that helps us to understand why a high sugar diet, in addition to being acidic, which creates calcium loss through the urine, it also degrades the protein structure, which is part of that overall tensile strength mechanism. So what's really interesting to me is not just focusing on the mineral content, but focusing on how to preserve the strength and integrity of these proteins. So that's new stuff, and that's all in the book as well.
And this has to be why different cultures are actually experiencing bone issues in different ways.
I would say so, yes, because going back to the South Africans, they have really low levels, the Bantu in South Africa, that is, really low levels of calcium intake. Their calcium intake is about 300 milligrams per day, which we would throw our hands up in amazement and say, well, that's way less than the RDA. You cannot survive on less than 700 milligrams or maybe even 1,000 milligrams, or if you live in the States, 1,200 milligrams a day is what's being recommended. But we can't just focus on that, because what we have to think about is what are we losing and what are those triggers for that calcium loss. So it's not necessarily our intake that's the important thing, because the body's quite good at recycling stuff. What's important is the rate at which we lose things that are beneficial for the bone's structural integrity. So if we're losing calcium hand over fist by having an acidic diet that is based on meat and dairy products rather than being based on plant material, then we actually lose calcium much faster than tribes in Africa who are whose diet is fundamentally based on plants. And this is the really important differentiation between whether or not we are a society that focuses on meat consumption and therefore risks high levels of osteoporosis in our population, or whether we base our diet on plants, because it's not necessarily the calcium intake that's the important thing. It's the ratio of plant-based consumption to animal-based consumption, which seems to make the biggest difference to fracture rate. And it's not just the density of the bones that's important, because you can have really dense bones that look dense on X-ray but aren't particularly strong necessarily. So we don't always even want to look at BMD, which stands for bone mineral density. What we want to look at is how resistant that bone is to fracture. And looking just on X-rays at the BMD will not always tell you whether you're at risk from fractures. And a lot of fracture risks are missed just by the modalities that we're currently using for testing bone density. But the good news about that is that there's some really interesting studies that are going on at the moment, particularly in the States, to develop new techniques for measuring the likely fracture risk that we've got, which is more important than bone mineral density in its own right. So the good news is, in maybe about 5 years' time, women might be able to walk into their doctor's surgery and he will have this little unit sitting on his consulting table, and he'll be able to just spray your your shin with a little bit of local anaesthetic, take a quick reading with this little desktop reader and say, yes, you are at risk of fractures, or no, you are not. And it's going to be more accurate than sending people for bone scans. So that's the future of technology for the diagnosis of how much at risk we are. And I think this is going to perhaps turn the current medical model a little bit more on its head, which can only be a good thing.
Now, let me bring you back to the low glycemic index again, because I actually think, you made a really good point at the beginning, and you're following that, but you also say in one of your chapters about the sugar being the fourth deadly sin. And
yes.
That has to be a massive factor within different cultures. You see, the quantity of sugar, I was reading, it's about 120 pounds, isn't it, or something a year that people are consuming in the
That's
UK.
Right.
It's about 194 or something in the States.
God, is it as much as that?
Yeah.
It's gone up, hasn't it? Yeah, it's gone up. It was about 150 in 2012, so it's even gone up in the last 3 years. That's shocking, isn't it?
It is, and it does wide scale damage, through from inflammation right through to bone health. Just explain that so that people truly understand, because the low glycemic focus of your diet is actually fundamental for what you're doing, isn't it?
It is, and I think I couldn't really do what I do without basing my diet on green plants rather than high glycemic fruit. So fundamentally, sugar in all of its guises. We're not just talking sugar that we find in granulated form in 2-pound bags. We're talking about sugar that is present in, for people that aren't on a particularly healthy diet, sugars that are hidden sugars in ready meals, for example, added sugars in soups and snacks and biscuits and goodness knows what else. But also sugar from dried fruit, hybridized fruit, because it fundamentally all does pretty much the same thing in the body. One of the problems with sugar is that it's empty. It's described as empty calories. So in other words, it does not switch off your hormonal mechanism, which tells you that you're full. There's an interesting hormone that you produce after eating called leptin. And what leptin does is it indicates satiety. In other words, it tells you to stop eating because you've had enough, you've consumed enough of whatever it is. And when you have a diet that's high in sugar, particularly high in fructose, then fructose inhibits the satiety mechanism. It switches off leptin. So in other words, you kind of end up overeating. And this is one of the things which we consider is one of the major triggers for the overeating, which subsequently leads on ultimately to the obesity crisis that we're currently facing. But sugar's got a lot of other detrimental difficulties associated with it. So, for example, it increases the adrenaline response. Now, adrenaline is your fear, fight and flight mechanism. And we do not want that to be switched on the whole time. It's very, very useful if you're just about to be eaten by a lion. But what isn't useful is if you're sitting in a traffic jam 10 minutes late for a meeting, it doesn't serve any purpose. You're not going to actually get to your destination any quicker by raising your blood pressure, pushing your blood flow to your muscles and getting ready to sprint. It doesn't work like that because you can't sprint when you're stuck in a traffic jam unless you want to dump your car and just run. So it's physiologically a very useful mechanism for crisis moments. And I don't know that the human species would still be here if we didn't have it. But what isn't appropriate is this chronic low-grade stress response that keeps the adrenal glands firing up, and using up bodily reserves of energy. Because fundamentally what you're doing is if you're increasing your adrenaline production the whole time via external stressors or by internal stressors such as a high sugar diet, what you're doing is you're continuously stressing yourself even though you may not be aware of it. And that runs the body down. So that's one of the disadvantages of a high sugar diet. And there are many others. Other ones, for example, might be the fact that it interferes with the sex hormones. So, for example, if you have a high sugar diet, it will suppress testosterone in blokes. We don't want blokes having testosterone suppressed. That's not a good idea. And in women, it messes about with the ratios between estrogen and progesterone. So it also massively increases premenstrual syndrome. So if there's any men out there listening to this and your partner has real problems with PMS, then cut the sugar. I think you'll find there'll be a big difference. And there's lots and lots of other difficulties. Obviously, we know about tooth rot, where our teeth are going to turn brown and fall out if we have too much sugar. We know about that. The answer from the British sugar industry, cunningly disguised as a website called Sugar Nutrition UK, they will tell us that all we have to do is brush our teeth with fluoride toothpaste and eat cheese because that will reduce the detrimental effect, or possibly detrimental effect, should we say, of sugar consumption. So they don't even understand that the industry is problematic, and they are promoting sugar consumption as part of a healthy, balanced diet. I disagree with their approach, I have to say. So apologies to anybody from Sugar Nutrition UK, but I don't believe in what you're doing. I don't think it's the correct thing to do. So controversies aside, sugar is harmful. It's not a substance that we want to consume a lot of. Even in its natural form in fruit, when it's combined with the fibre, which reduces the rate at which it's absorbed, you still don't want to base your diet just on fruit, because ultimately you will not get a correct nutritional balance if you do so. You have to have the mineral-dense greens, and you have to reduce the rate at which your sugar is absorbed. So if you're a bit of a sugar fiend and you like smoothies that are full of fruit, then what you want to be doing is adding some greens to those so that you gradually increase the green quantities in there and you gradually reduce the sweet fruit, because otherwise you are going to run into the same sort of challenges as people that are eating sugar as its processed form, such as table sugar. It's just as bad as eating too much fruit.
And, you know, I hate to say it, but my mother was right when she said eat your greens.
Yeah, absolutely. Mothers were right. But what you don't want to do is eat your greens that have been boiled to death for 3 hours prior to consumption. So, you know, there's people that used to have a granny that, for example, would put the greens on to put your sprouts or your cabbage on to boil at 6 o'clock in the morning when you were coming round for lunch at 1 p.m. You may as well just drink the water and lick the ceiling, because that's where all the nutrients went. You don't want to be boiling your greens to death, because have you noticed with the green foods, if you boil them, they lose their colour. The colour ends up in the water. What is that colour? That's the chlorophyll. That's the stuff that's really good for you. That's got lots of magnesium in it. Magnesium's good for bone health. So if you want to preserve your bone health, you need not just calcium, you need magnesium, you need boron, you need silicon, you need a lot of other things that you can read about in the book. And what you don't want to do is boil something to the extent where all of that beneficial mineral content is lost into the water in which it's boiled. Even top chefs understand this. And I was listening to Radio 4 the other week, and they had Raymond Blanc on there, obviously a very famous super chef. And he was saying that he believed it was a crime against vegetables to boil them. It was his big thing. He was just making sure that nobody boiled their vegetables. So even top chefs know about this, because his point of view was it destroys the flavour. But my point of view is it destroys the nutrition. So I should get together with him, and we should try and start a campaign to stop people boiling their vegetables to death, because it's really not the best thing to do. And I mean, fine, if you do that, you're not necessarily doing yourself any harm by eating it, but you're not getting the benefits that you should be. You will not still get the benefits that food initially contained. So your best option is minimal processing.
And I love the title, Crimes Against Veg.
Yes. I had to laugh when I heard that, because I just thought, this is what I'm saying. I'm coming from a different perspective, because his perspective, of course, was flavour. My perspective is nutrients, which then relate ultimately to generation of better health. But ultimately, it's all about the same thing, isn't it? You don't want to process something to within an inch of its life and then expect it to be good for you. It's just not going to happen.
You're absolutely right. Now, how would the layperson know from the outside that there is an issue with their bone health?
It's very difficult, to be honest. There are ways of finding out. What you can do is you can have a bone scan, but it's not the most accurate way of determining your bone health. So at this time, we're relatively limited with what we can find out. However, there are certain ways in which you can get tested in different ways. So, for example, if you start to lose height, then you already potentially are in the situation of vertebral crush fractures. Now, obviously, from a health perspective, we want to approach things before we get to that point. You do not want to wait until you see the back being bent to the extent that you can't straighten it again. The dowager's hump that we see in a lot of old ladies, that's as a result of vertebral crush fracture. So anybody that starts to or considers that they're even possibly starting to lose height, action needs to be taken. But better still, before that. Now, blood tests will not show up osteoporosis specifically, but what they will show up is something called a biomarker of bone turnover. So, in other words, putting that into sort of English, a biomarker is basically something that indicates something that's going on in the body. So, for example, there are certain enzymes that we have in the body that are responsive to certain changes in the bones. And one of them is abbreviated to SAP. That stands for serum alkaline phosphatase, for those that are interested. And if that enzyme is elevated, it means that bone turnover is greater. SAP is elevated in young people. Anybody below the age of about 15 will have a sky-high SAP. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It means they're young and that their bones are growing and there's greater bone turnover. However, what you don't want is a high SAP when you're older, because it could indicate that there's a bone issue. It could also indicate that there's a gut issue because it's not specific to bone tissue. So it just gives you an idea. The other thing that's really important to mention here is vitamin D status. And probably a lot of people in the UK, because of our wonderful climate with so little sun, is the fact that we probably are not getting as much vitamin D as we need. And vitamin D is important because it's not only essential from a bone health perspective, but it also has a knock-on effect because there are probably 200 different biological reactions in the body which are responsible, or with which vitamin D has a part to play. So vitamin D is not just important for our bone strength and our bone integrity, it's important for our overall health. And we're also noticing now that there are links between certain types of cancer and low vitamin D status. So it's really important to try and have your vitamin D levels at an optimum level, which is between 50 and 70 nanograms per milliliter of blood. So getting a vitamin D test is something that's a really worthwhile thing, because apparently 1 in 6 people in the UK are severely deficient on blood testing. And that means one of two things. Either you have to start oral supplementation as soon as possible, or you have to get out in the sun and tan but don't burn. And I think we've just all become so fearful of sun exposure, haven't we? Because we're told that, oh, you go out in the sun, it will cause skin cancer and blah, blah, blah. There's kids in my area near Southampton that are getting rickets because their parents are sticking factor 50 on them before they even go outside for 20 seconds in the winter. I mean, it's got to such ridiculous levels of fear of the sun. But the fact is we need the sun. But vitamin D is really important. So if you're concerned about your bone integrity, it's really a good idea to get a general biochemistry profile done, blood test, and also get a vitamin D status test done, because that will give you an indication whether or not there might be some kind of insidious eating away of the bone health as a result of low vitamin D levels. So do look at that if you're concerned.
Yeah, I think I know several of my clients are having difficulties in getting vitamin D tests now on the NHS.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So, but I think bone health is really just indicative of overall health issues, isn't it?
It is, definitely, yes. Because, funnily enough, all the things that are good for your bones are actually good for the rest of your body. So they'd be good for your skin, they'd be good for your eye health, they'd be good for strong hair and nails. So, you know, the vanity stuff. They're also good for maintenance of ideal body weight, something that is on everybody's mind at the moment, isn't it? But also, a diet that's good for strong bones is also going to be an anti-aging, anti-cancer diet, anti-diabetes diet, anti-heart disease diet, because everything works together with everything else. And one of the things that we tend to find, I think, with the medical profession is that they like to compartmentalize us, don't they? They like to sort of tell us about what's good for bone health. Oh, you need this for your bones. Well, yeah, bones are important. Scaffolding's kind of quite important stuff. But your heart's quite important. Your liver's quite important. Your kidneys are fairly useful as well. So the good thing about the diet that I put forward, and there is a recipe section in the forthcoming book as well for anybody that thinks, yeah, well, this is all very well, but what do I make for lunch? Yeah. It helps people to get an idea of the sort of choices food-wise that I recommend. And it's absolutely not a recipe book. It's more of a sort of science and practical help book, because there's an exercise section as well. But also, my publishers felt it would be a good idea to put in some recipes. Not that I'm a great chef, but, you wouldn't want to come to dinner with me. It would be very basic. But just to give people an idea, once they read the book, they think, well, okay, what can I do now? What can I make for our dinner tonight? Because my husband might want this, that, or the other. So what I've done with the whole book itself is to try to be as practical as I can with regard to not just a diet that is bone friendly, but a diet that is realistic and practical for the real world, and also useful for anybody that wants to improve their overall health and not just the health of their bones.
I find it really interesting that people like yourself, and very much the way I've gone over the years, is my diet's become very basic. It's very salad orientated and vegetable orientated, and it's not exciting often in the slightest for people to look at. And yet, for me, I don't think about it anymore because I enjoy the benefits that it actually gives me.
Yes, yeah. And the other thing that's enjoyable about it is that it takes about 10 minutes to make.
Yes,
and I do not have have time. We've discussed about my sort of slightly ridiculously busy schedule. I don't have time to wait 40 minutes for something to come out of an oven. I don't have an oven, actually. My kitchen is completely set up for a raw food lifestyle. I don't possess an oven. I don't have a stove. I don't have a, hot plate or anything like that. So if anybody comes here for lunch, they have to eat raw because that's all I've got. It's just so much easier. You don't have to wait for an oven to heat up. You don't have to wait 40 minutes. I haven't got time to wait 40 minutes. I'm hungry now. It's when I get back from my run, I do not want to wait for something to be ready. I want to throw it on a plate and eat it in 5 minutes. And the good thing about the way that I my lifestyle, really, the way that is that I can open the fridge, take a plate out of the cupboard and do transfer. It's very, very straightforward. And whilst that might be perceived initially as a bit boring, it's incredibly convenient for busy people. So you do not have to spend hours in the kitchen with the recipes that I've stuck in the book. I think the longest one takes 40 minutes to prepare, but all of the others are about 10 minutes.
And I'm pleased that you put recipes in the book, because actually I know from my own experience with my clients and the groups that I run that actually when you introduce people to new foods and new ways of eating, they actually don't really know what to do with food anymore often, or how to put flavours and tastes together.
Absolutely.
It's one of the biggest things I come across, the lack of experimentation. Because I think I'm almost the last generation in some respects there. My mother taught me to cook, and my grandmother taught us to cook, and effectively we were taught in school how to cook. And that's just, I know that, I had a friend come around a few years ago and I said, "Oh, did you want some soup?" And she said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And I actually made it from scratch while she stood and said, "You're actually going to make it?" And it was at that point I realised that even just a generation below me, because she was only that much, she wasn't that much younger, that actually those skills were starting to be lost. And
yes, absolutely,
and they are now.
And it's such a shame, isn't it? Because back in the 50s and 60s, all meals were prepared from scratch, weren't they? And our nutritional profile back then was much more favourable than it is now. And just the advertising, for example, don't make food tonight, get a takeaway, phone this number. There's so much propaganda out there, isn't there, telling us that we shouldn't be cooking at home, we should be going out for dinner, or we should be having this ready meal, or we should be letting the supermarket do it for us. And yes, it's convenient, but at what cost? Yes,
and I do think an aspect of that is actually people's lives have become overextended and over busy, and actually one of the key things that they've forgotten about is nurturing themselves and the right food to fuel that, which is why so many people are exhausted nowadays.
Yeah, and it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Because they then they're tired and they don't want to be bothered, so then they get on that sort of downhill slide, unfortunately, of, I'll just stop off at the takeaway, or I'll just stop off at the supermarket and buy a ready meal and stick it in the microwave. And ultimately, by doing that, the lifestyle becomes degraded and the nutritional profile becomes degraded, because that is not a healthy way to live. And I think it just requires, ultimately it's going to require a mindset shift, isn't it? To get back to the more sort of basic needs of human health. And I think once we value ourselves as individuals, we will be prepared to do that. We'll be prepared to put in the effort because we feel that we are worth spending the time on. But I think a lot of the time we're not thinking about ourselves so much. We're not valuing ourselves as individuals, and we're always trying to sort this out, sort that out. I've got to do this and this. I've got to get the kids off to school. I've got to do this, that and the other. And we become the last person that we think about. And that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily value ourselves, but I think we need to make a conscious effort to do more for ourselves. And it's not selfish, it's self-love. And I think once we can bring back that concept of wanting to do the best for ourselves because we deserve it, we will then start to think about better food choices.
Max Tuck, another fabulous interview. Tell people how they get hold of you. Where do they find you? Where do they find your book? When is it out?
When is it out? I haven't got an exact release date, but it's being published by Hammersmith Health Books, and they, at the last email I got, they're heading for a publication date sometime in June of this year. And now, in the meantime, you can find me in quite a lot of places. I'm speaking at Brighton Veg Fest on the 29th of March, so very soon, actually, a couple of weeks' time for that one. If you want to come and cheer me on in the Brighton Marathon, if you're down that way, then give me a shout. That's the 12th of April. And I'm speaking at Bristol Veg Fest in May, and also London Veg Fest in October. And in the meantime, I will be, don't miss me on my retreat. I'm running a fantastic weekend retreat, which is going to be the 10th to the 12th of July. Full details of that are on rawfoodretreat.eu. And if you want to contact me directly, the best way to do that is via my website, which is therawfoodscientist.com.
Few
indeed. And I do actually also have another book that's been published by Hammersmith. That was published in February of last year. That's called The Whole Body Solution. So that is still available both on my website and via the usual outlets. So that one is a good introduction about everything to do with aspects of the whole body. We were speaking just now about compartmentalizing, and that the medical profession divide us into body systems. So if you want to know how to look after all of your body systems individually and collectively, then The Whole Body Solution is a good starting point.
Fabulous. I challenge you all to keep up with Max. Thank you very much, Max.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure as always.
Take care.